Hello everyone. Tonight we journey with you across frozen seas and ancient ice, following the footsteps of medieval explorers who ventured into lands where the sun barely rises and the cold shapes everything. Before we begin this story of quiet endurance and timeless wisdom, if you enjoy narratives that help you relax and drift into peaceful rest, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel, only if these stories truly bring you comfort. Now, settle in, dim the lights, and let this tale carry you gently forward into the cold. As the medieval explorers followed in silence, when the ice sang in the morning, their breath formed clouds that hung in the still air like prayers offered to an indifferent sky. The sound came first, not wind, not waves, but something else entirely, a deep resonance that traveled through the frozen sea beneath their feet, a groaning melody that seemed to rise from the very bones of the earth. The ice was speaking, as it did every dawn when temperature shifted and pressure changed within its crystalline structure. William stopped walking and raised his hand. Behind him, 12 men halted immediately, their footsteps ceasing in unison. They had learned to move as one body during the 3 months since leaving the Norwegian coast. Survival demanded it. The ice song grew louder. Cracks formed and sealed, invisible beneath the snow but audible as sharp reports that echoed across the white expanse. This was the morning ritual, the ice adjusting to the rising sun, expanding and contracting in ways that could split a man's confidence as easily as it split the frozen surface. "Safe passage," Thomas murmured beside William. It was not a question. Thomas had crossed ice fields before, years ago, and he recognized the sounds that meant stability rather than danger. William nodded slowly. His beard, thick with frost, barely moved. Every gesture was calculated now. Energy was precious. Movement meant warmth, but unnecessary movement meant wasted heat. They stood on what had been open sea 3 months earlier. Now it was a vast white plain, stretching to a horizon that seemed impossibly far, yet somehow close enough to touch. The sky and ice blurred together at the edges, creating an endless pale space that played tricks on the eyes. Behind them, days of travel had left barely any trace. Snow filled their footprints within hours. The wind erased their path as quickly as they made it. It was as if the ice rejected the memory of their passage, preferring to remain unmarked and pristine. Ahead lay their destination, though none of them had seen it, a land spoken of in whispers by Norse traders, a place where walrus gathered by the thousands, where the shores held treasures for those brave or foolish enough to reach them. The medieval world hungered for ivory, and walrus tusk commanded prices that could change a man's fortune. But first, they had to survive the crossing.
The group consisted of 13 men, all from coastal villages in England and Norway. William led them, chosen not for nobility but for experience. He had sailed northern waters for 20 years, had felt the bite of Arctic cold, had learned to read ice the way farmers read soil. Thomas was his second, a quiet man of 40 winters who spoke rarely but moved with the efficiency of someone who understood cold intimately. His hands were scarred through frostbite suffered in his youth, but he had kept all his fingers, a rarity among men who worked in frozen conditions. The others ranged from 17 to 50. Young Robert, barely old enough to grow a proper beard, carried the hope of his entire family. His village had pooled resources to outfit him for this journey, betting their future on his safe return with ivory to sell. He walked carefully, conscious that dozens of people depended on him. Edmund was the eldest, a man who had buried 3 wives and now sought fortune to secure his remaining years. His movements were slower than the others, but his knowledge of survival was deep. He noticed things younger men missed, small signs in the snow, shifts in the wind, the subtle changes in ice color that meant danger or safety. John, Michael, Richard, Peter, Simon, David, Stephen, Andrew, and Martin completed the group. Each man carried his own reasons for being here, his own hopes, his own fears. But on the ice, individual motivations mattered less than collective survival. They traveled light by necessity. Heavy loads meant slower progress, and slower progress meant more nights exposed to cold that can kill. Each man carried a share of supplies: dried fish, hard bread, a portion of seal meat traded from coastal hunters, small amounts of honey and salt. Their clothing was layered carefully: wool against the skin, leather over that, and outmost, sealskin coats that blocked wind. Boots were lined with grass that they changed each evening, keeping feet dry being essential to keeping feet attached to legs. They pulled sleds, simple wooden constructions that glided over snow when loaded properly and dragged miserably when unbalanced. On these sleds rode their tent, made from walrus hide stretched over bone frames. It was heavy, but necessary. Nights without shelter meant death. William studied the ice ahead, looking for the telltale signs he had learned to recognize. Blue ice was old and strong. White ice could be new and unreliable. Gray areas meant water beneath, pressure ridges where ice unbuckled and piled up. These ridges could be navigated, but they required careful route selection. We continue east, he decided. Follow the smooth ice as long as it holds. The men adjusted their loads and resumed walking. There was no complaint. Complaining changed nothing and wasted breath that was needed for moving. The morning sun, pale and distant, climbed slowly above the horizon. It would not rise high today.
This far north, winter's sun traced a low arc, giving light but little warmth. The cold was a constant presence, not something that came and went, but something that simply existed, as fundamental as gravity. Robert felt it in his lungs with every breath. The air was so cold it seemed to freeze moisture inside him, making each inhalation a small act of will. He had learned to breathe through cloth, using his scarf to warm air before it entered his body. It helped, though it left the scarf stiff with ice. Young men thought they knew cold. They thought a hard winter in their village, a night spent outdoors tending livestock, gave them understanding. Then they came to places like this and learned that cold had depths they had never imagined. This cold was patient. It waited. It tested every weakness, every gap in clothing, every moment of carelessness. The ice sang again, a different note this time, lower, more resonant. The men paused instinctively, waiting to see if the sound meant danger. It was simply the ice settling. As temperatures changed throughout the day, the frozen sea adjusted. Sometimes gently, sometimes with violence that sent cracks racing across the surface faster than a man could run. Learning to distinguish between the two types of sounds was essential. William listened carefully, then nodded. They walked on. Hours passed in a rhythm that was becoming familiar. Walk, rest briefly. Walk again. Stop for a small meal eaten standing up, bodies in motion to prevent stiffening. Walk more. The landscape barely changed, white in all directions, punctuated occasionally by pressure ridges that looked like frozen waves. By midday, if it could be called midday when the sun barely moved, they had covered perhaps 5 miles. Good progress on ice, where footing was uncertain and loads were heavy. William counted distance not in miles, but in days. At this pace, they might reach land in another week, maybe 2. That was the calculation that governed everything. Food supplies measured against distance, energy expenditure balanced against cold. Each day they moved forward was a day closer to their goal, but also a day deeper into territory where retreat became less viable. Edmund understood this arithmetic. He had seen expeditions fail, had known men who set out confidently and never returned. The ice kept its dead, entombing them in white silence. There would be no markers, no graves, just absence. But dwelling on such thoughts served no purpose. You focused on the step in front of you. You checked your companions for signs of frostbite. You kept moving until it was time to stop. This was how you survived. As the sun began its descent, which happened earlier each day as they traveled north, William called a halt. They had found a relatively flat area sheltered slightly by a low-pressure ridge. Not ideal, but adequate. The tent went up with practiced efficiency. 12 men working together, each knowing his role.
The walrus hide was heavy and stiff with cold, but they wrestled it into position over the bone frame. Stakes were driven into ice with mallets. Guy lines were secured. Inside this shelter they would spend the night. 13 bodies packed closely, sharing warmth, breathing the same condensation-heavy air. It was uncomfortable, often miserable, but it kept them alive. A small fire was lit, carefully contained in a stone-lined pit they carried with them. Fuel was precious, limited to seal blubber and small amounts of driftwood they had brought from the coast. The fire was not for warmth, though heat was welcome. It was for melting ice into water and cooking a small hot meal. Water was critical. You could not eat snow directly. It lowered body temperature dangerously. Ice had to be melted slowly, efficiently. Each man was allowed 2 cups of water with his evening meal. It was not enough, but it was what they could manage. The meal was simple: dried fish softened in hot water, a small portion of seal meat, hard bread that required strong teeth. They ate in silence, conserving energy, focusing on the ritual of nourishment. Robert watched the others, learning from their efficiency. Nothing was wasted. Crumbs were collected. Bones were saved for soup the next day. Every calorie mattered. After eating, there was a brief period before sleep where men tended to small tasks. Clothing was checked and repaired. Boots were dried near the fire, carefully monitored so they would not burn or dry too quickly and crack. Wet grass was removed from inside boots and replaced with dry grass carried for this purpose. Thomas sharpened his knife, the rhythmic sound of stone on metal somehow comforting. Tools needed to be maintained. A dull blade was dangerous, requiring extra force that led to slips and cuts. In this cold, even small injuries could become serious. William reviewed their supplies mentally, calculating days remaining against distance to travel. The numbers were tight but manageable if nothing went wrong. That if contained multitudes of potential disasters. But such thoughts were set aside as darkness deepened. Sleep was necessary. Bodies needed rest to function. Tomorrow would demand everything they had, as would the day after and the day after that. They arranged themselves inside the tent with care. The weakest sleepers, those who generated less body heat, were placed in the middle. The strongest formed an outer layer. Edmund, despite his age, insisted on an outer position. His experience kept him warm. Robert found himself between John and Michael, grateful for the shared warmth. He could feel heat radiating from both sides, could hear their breathing slow as sleep approached. The tent was not silent. Wind pressed against the hide walls, finding gaps, whistling softly. Ice creaked and groaned outside, its endless song continuing through the night. Men shifted positions, coughed, murmured in their sleep. Robert lay awake longer than most, his mind too active to rest immediately. He thought of home, of his mother who had embraced him fiercely before he left, of his younger sisters who looked at him with such hope. He could not fail them. He would not. Eventually, exhaustion claimed him. His breathing deepened and slowed, joining the collective rhythm of 13 men sleeping in a small space, their combined warmth creating a fragile bubble of survival against the vast cold outside. The ice sang through the night, adjusting, settling, speaking its ancient language to anyone who would listen. By morning, it would sing again, marking the start of another day, another test, another step forward into the frozen unknown. Morning came without drama. No dawn chorus of birds, no rooster's call, just gradual lightning visible through gaps in the tent hide, and the familiar sounds of ice adjusting to temperature changes. William woke first, as he always did. His body had trained itself over years to wake before full light, to use those quiet moments to prepare his mind for the day ahead. He listened carefully. Wind had died during the night. That was good. Calm days meant easier travel. He nudged Thomas, who woke instantly, alert as always. Together they began the morning routine while others still slept. The fire was revived from carefully banked embers, a delicate process that required patience and dry tinder they kept in waterproof pouches. Water was set to heat. Morning tea, weak and barely flavored, but hot. The warmth mattered more than taste. It spread through the body, waking muscles, preparing them for the work ahead. One by one, the others woke. No one complained about the cold or the cramped space or the stiffness in their joints. Complaints were pointless. This was simply how mornings were now. They ate a small breakfast, less than they wanted but as much as supplies allowed. Dried fish again, a small piece of hard bread, the hot tea. Eating generated heat. The body burns fuel to create warmth. They needed food not just for energy, but for survival. Robert's fingers fumbled with his bootlaces, stiff from cold, despite sleeping with them close to his body. Edmund noticed and showed him a technique. Warm the laces first by holding them against your stomach under your clothes. It took time, but it worked. The laces became pliable enough to tie properly. These small lessons passed between the men constantly. Knowledge shared was knowledge multiplied. Each man brought different experiences, different solutions to common problems. The tent was packed with the same efficiency it had been erected. Hide folded precisely, bones stacked, stakes collected. Everything had its place on the sleds. Weight distributed evenly, straps checked for wear.
They drank more water before leaving, using the last heat from the morning fire to melt extra ice. Hydration mattered. Dehydrated bodies cooled faster, worked less efficiently. Then they were moving again.
Following William's lead, pulling sleds, walking into another day. The ice sang differently this morning. Higher notes, more frequent. Thomas mentioned that it sounded like the ice was thinner here. William agreed. They adjusted their course slightly, moving toward what looked like older, more stable ice. You learn to trust your eyes and ears on the ice. Visual cues combined with sound to create a map of safety and danger. Blue ice, good. White ice, questionable. Gray ice, avoid. Deep sounds, stable. High sounds, warning. Sharp cracks, immediate danger. By mid-morning, they encountered their first real obstacle. A pressure ridge rose before them, perhaps 20 feet high, stretching north and south as far as they could see. Ice blocks the size of houses were piled in chaotic jumbles, frozen in mid-tumble like a wave turned to stone. These ridges formed when ice sheets collided, driven by currents and wind. The resulting formations could be impassable, requiring long detours, or they could be navigated carefully, saving time but requiring risk. William studied the ridge, looking for a passage. The sleds would need to be unloaded and carried over in pieces. It would take hours, but going around might take days, and they could not afford days. We cross here, he decided, pointing to a section where the blocks seemed less chaotic, where something resembling a path existed between the larger pieces. The work began. Sleds were unpacked carefully. Each item was carried separately over the ridge. The hide tent was unwieldy but manageable with 4 men. Food supplies distributed among everyone. Tools and weapons strapped to backs. Robert found himself carrying a bundle of dried fish and a water skin. He followed Michael up the ridge, stepping carefully. Ice here was not smooth. It was jagged, treacherous. A fall could mean broken bones, and broken bones meant death. The climb was exhausting. He had to pause twice, breathing hard, feeling his heart pound. The cold air burned his lungs, but he made it to the top, and then down the other side, and then back for another load. 3 trips each man made, up and over, up and over, up and over. Hours of work in cold that never relented. But eventually, everything was across. The sleds were repacked. The line formed again. They continued east. Noon brought a brief rest and a small meal. William rationed the food carefully, measuring portions by eye, ensuring fairness. In groups like this, perceived unfairness could destroy morale faster than cold destroyed fingers. The men ate standing, bodies moving slightly to maintain warmth. Sitting meant stiffening, and stiffening meant slower starts, more vulnerable periods. Edmund noticed that Simon was favoring his left foot, stepping gingerly. Frostbite, perhaps, or just a blister. Either was dangerous. He mentioned it to William quietly. William approached Simon carefully. "Your foot?" Simon hesitated, then nodded. "Toe. Left side. Numb this morning." This was serious.
Numbness meant tissue damage. Tissue damage meant potential loss of the toe, possibly more. But there was nothing to be done now except monitor it. Stopping to examine it meant exposing flesh to air even colder than inside the boot. That could make things worse. "Keep it moving," William advised. "Wiggle your toes as you walk. When we camp tonight, we'll check it properly." Simon nodded, grateful that no judgment had been passed. Everyone knew that frostbite could happen to anyone. It was not weakness. It was simply the price the cold sometimes demanded. They walked on. The afternoon passed in that same rhythm. Step, pull, step, breathe. The ice continued its song, a constant background to their movement. The sun traced its low arc, providing light without warmth, beauty without comfort. By evening they had covered another 5 miles, perhaps 6. William felt cautiously satisfied. Good progress, no disasters. Simon's foot was concerning, but not yet critical. Camp was made in the lee of another pressure ridge, slightly better shelter than the previous night. The tent went up, the fire was lit, water was melted. After the evening meal, William examined Simon's foot. The toe was discolored, darker than it should be, but not black. Not yet. The tissue was still alive, but damaged. "Warmth," William prescribed. "Keep it against your body tonight. Direct skin contact. Someone will need to share body heat with you." John volunteered without hesitation. This was how they survived. Someone had an injury, others compensated. Tomorrow it might be John who needed help.
and someone would provide it just as readily. The night passed as nights did, cold, uncomfortable, but endurable. The tent leaked heat constantly, but 13 bodies produced enough warmth to maintain a livable temperature inside. Not comfortable, but livable. Robert dreamed of fire, huge bonfires that roared and crackled, heat so intense it pushed you back. He woke disappointed to find only the small, carefully managed flame of their cooking fire, banked now to mere embers. But he was alive. They were all alive. Another day survived. Another night endured. The ice sang its morning song, and they prepared to walk again. This became the pattern. Days blurred together, each similar to the last. Walk, rest, walk, camp, sleep, wake, walk again. The landscape remained unchanging, an endless white expanse that tested the mind as much as the body. On the 5th day after crossing the pressure ridge, they saw something different. A dark line on the horizon, too straight to be natural ice formations, too deliberate to be a trick of light. William stopped the group and studied it carefully. Thomas joined him, shading his eyes against the glare. "Open water," Thomas said quietly. The words hung heavy. Open water meant their route was blocked. Ice ended, sea began. They would need to go around, and around could mean days or weeks of additional travel.
Or the water might extend too far, making the journey impossible. They approached carefully, confirming what they had feared. A lead had opened in the ice, a crack that had widened into a channel of dark water, perhaps 200 yards across. Steam rose from the surface, where relatively warm seawater met frigid air. The lead stretched north and south beyond sight. Going around would add tremendous distance to their journey, but crossing was impossible. The water would kill them in minutes. William made camp early, needing time to think. This was a crisis point. Supplies were calculated for a direct route. Lengthy detours meant food would run short. But there was no choice. They had to go around. That night, tension sat heavy among the men. Robert could feel it, though no one spoke of it directly. They were deep into the ice now, committed. Turning back meant admitting defeat, but continuing forward carried increasing risk. Edmund broke the silence. "I've seen leads close as quickly as they open. If we wait, the cold might seal it." William considered this. It was true. Ice formed rapidly in these temperatures, but waiting meant consuming supplies without making progress, a dangerous gamble. "We wait one day," William decided. "If the lead hasn't closed by tomorrow evening, we turn south and go around." It was a compromise, a small gamble. One day would not deplete supplies catastrophically, but waiting longer could. They settled in for an anxious night. The lead groaned and creaked, sounds different from the solid ice they had grown accustomed to. Water sounds, movement sounds, the liquid sea asserting itself against the frozen surface. Robert couldn't sleep well. His mind kept calculating. How much food remained? How many days to land if they had to go around? The mathematics were discouraging. But mathematics were not destiny. He had seen enough in his short life to know that determination mattered. They would find a way. They had to. Morning brought unexpected fortune. The lead had not closed, but it had narrowed. Ice was forming at the edges, creeping inward, still too wide to cross, but smaller than yesterday. They waited through the day, watching the lead contract. Inch by inch, the ice claimed back territory the sea had briefly held. By evening, the channel was perhaps 50 yards across. Still too wide, but William noticed something else. Ice floes were drifting in the lead, moving slowly with current. Some of these floes were large, stable. "We can use them," he said quietly to Thomas. "Jump from floe to floe, get everyone across." Thomas looked doubtful. "Risk?" "High. But so is going around. We're 3 days behind schedule already. Food won't last if we add another week." They discussed it with the group. The choice was presented honestly. Risk crossing the lead using ice floes as stepping stones, or turn south and accept a much longer journey with dwindling supplies. The men voted to cross, not unanimously, but by majority.
Simon, still nursing his damaged toe, was one who voted to try. Robert admired his courage. They spent the remaining daylight preparing. Ropes were checked and reinforced. They would cross one at a time, secured by rope held by men on both sides once the first man made it across. William would go first. As leader, he would not ask others to take risks he wouldn't face himself. Thomas would go last, ensuring everyone got across before him. Night fell before they could begin. Crossing in darkness would be suicide. They camped at the lead's edge, and few slept well. Tomorrow would test them more severely than any day so far. Dawn came pale and cold. The lead was still there, perhaps 40 yards across now. Ice floes drifted in its dark water, moving slowly. Some looked stable, others tilted dangerously. William selected his route, choosing floes that appeared thick and solid.
He removed his sled harness, keeping only essential gear. Heavy clothing stayed, but packs were left behind. He would carry only a rope. The first jump was 3 feet, nothing in normal circumstances. Everything here. If he slipped, if the floe tilted, if ice broke beneath him, the water would pull him down. The weight of his clothes would drag him under. Death would come in seconds. He jumped, landed solid. The floe barely moved under his weight. Good ice. The next jump was longer, 5 feet. He gathered himself, focused, and leapt. Landed hard but stayed upright. 2 floes crossed. The watching men barely breathed. This was their leader, their guide. If he failed, their chances failed with him. Jump 3, 4 feet to a larger floe that looked ancient and stable. William made it easily. He was halfway now. Jump 4 brought the first real problem. The target floe was tilted, and when he landed, it shifted under his weight. William dropped to his knees instantly, spreading his weight, keeping his center low. The floe rocked, then stabilized. He stood slowly, carefully, assessed the next jump. Jump 5, jump 6. Each one a test of nerve and judgment. Land wrong and you die. Hesitate and you die. The cold gave no second chances. Finally, he reached the far side. Solid ice beneath his boots. He turned and raised his hand, signaling success. A rope was thrown across. William secured it. Now they had a lifeline. The next man would cross with rope attached, so if he fell, he could be pulled to safety. Theoretically. In practice, anyone who went into water that cold would be unconscious before the rope tightened, but the illusion of safety helped. Robert watched as Edmund went next. The old man moved with surprising agility, his experience showing. He made each jump deliberately, testing each landing before committing his full weight. He crossed successfully. One by one, the men crossed, some easily, some barely. Simon struggled with his injured foot but made it, though he nearly fell on the 7th jump. Michael, crossing behind him, reached out and steadied him. Both made it across. Robert's turn came. His heart pounded. He had watched the others, had memorized the pattern. Jump 1 to the flat floe, jump 2 to the rounded one, jump 3 to the long piece that looked like a frozen log. He jumped. The cold air rushed past. He landed, absorbed the impact through his legs, kept his balance, 1 down. Jump 2, jump 3. He was moving faster than he should, adrenaline pushing him. He forced himself to slow down. Careful was better than quick. Jump 4 to the tilted floe. It shifted under him, and his stomach lurched. He dropped low, just as William had done. The floe steadied. He breathed. 3 more jumps, 3 more moments where everything could go wrong. But they didn't. His boots found solid ice on the far side. He had made it. Only Thomas remained. He crossed last as planned, ensuring no one was left behind. His experience showed. He made the crossing look almost easy, though everyone knew it was anything but. All 13 men stood on the far side of the lead. They had gambled and won. The relief was palpable, but not celebrated. Energy was too precious for celebration. They retrieved their sleds by pulling them across on ropes, one at a time. Delicate work, but it succeeded. Everything they needed was now on the far side. William allowed a brief rest, then they moved on. The lead had cost them time and stress, but they had overcome it. The journey continued. That night, there was a different feeling in the tent. They had faced serious danger and survived through skill and courage. Confidence grew, though William warned against overconfidence. The ice would test them again. It always did. Robert slept better than he had in days. They were making progress. Land had to be getting closer. He dreamed of walrus herds and ivory tusks, of returning home wealthy enough to change his family's future. The dreams were pleasant, but morning brought them back to reality. The cold remained. The ice remained. The journey was far from over. Days continued in their rhythm. Walk, rest, walk, camp, sleep. The pattern was unchanging, though the landscape varied slightly. More pressure ridges occurred, requiring crossings. Ice fields stretched smooth and endless. The sun traced its low arc, marking time without warmth. Simon's toe, despite their efforts, turned black. William made the hard decision. The toe had to come off before infection spread. Edmund had done field amputations before, though never in conditions like these. They made camp early, built the fire hotter than usual, heated a knife blade until it glowed. Simon drank water mixed with what little alcohol they had, enough to dull the pain slightly. The procedure was quick. Edmund was skilled. Simon screamed but didn't struggle. The blackened toe was removed, the wound cauterized with L-light blade. The smell was terrible, but the work was clean. Simon survived the operation, and the night that followed.
His foot ached, but the rest of his toes remained healthy. He would walk with a limp, but he would walk. In this place, that was victory enough. This incident sobered everyone. The ice had claimed its price. A toe was a small payment compared to what it could have taken, but it was a reminder. The cold was patient, always waiting for mistakes. They walked more carefully after that, checked their feet more regularly, changed the grass in their boots more often.
Small preventative measures that can mean the difference between returning home whole or not at all. On the 14th day since crossing the lead, they saw birds, gulls flying overhead, their calls strange after so long in silence. Birds meant land was close. Land meant shore. Shore meant their destination was approaching. Energy increased. Steps quickened slightly. After so long on featureless ice, the possibility of actual land felt almost unreal. By evening of that day they could see it, a dark line on the horizon that wasn't cloud or shadow or illusion, solid land rising from the ice. Mountains, or at least hills, covered in snow but unmistakably solid earth. They made camp that night with something approaching hope. Tomorrow or the next day they would reach land. The ice crossing would be complete. The most dangerous part of their journey would be behind them. But William remained cautious. "We're not there yet," he reminded them. "The ice near land can be unstable. Shore ice breaks and shifts. We approach carefully tomorrow." His caution was warranted. The next morning they discovered that the ice between them and land was indeed unstable. Cracks appeared everywhere. The ice was newer, thinner. Tide and currents made it shift constantly. They tested each step, used poles to prow ahead, moved slowly, so slowly it felt like barely moving at all. But slow was safe, and safe was what mattered. By midday they were close enough to hear waves, actual waves breaking against actual shore. The sound was like music after the endless silence of the ice. By late afternoon they stepped off the ice onto frozen ground, solid earth beneath their boots. The feeling was indescribable. After weeks on ice that shifted and groaned, ground that didn't move felt impossibly stable. They made camp that night on land, real land. The relief was enormous. They had crossed the ice sea. 13 men had set out, and 13 men had arrived. Simon was minus a toe, but alive. Everyone else was intact. The next day they explored, and found what they had come for. A rocky beach covered with walrus. Hundreds of them, massive creatures basking on stones, their tusks gleaming in the pale light. The ivory was here. Their journey had succeeded. The walrus beach stretched for half a mile along the shore, a massive gathering of animals that grunted and bellowed, their sounds carrying across the frozen landscape. William approached carefully, studying the herd from a distance.
These creatures were dangerous despite their ungainly appearance on land. Their tusks could gore a man, their bulk could crush him. But they also represented fortune. Each tusk could bring enough silver to feed a family for a year. The group had not come all this way to leave empty-handed. "We build a proper camp first," William decided. "Shelter, food stores, defenses. Then we hunt." This was wisdom. Rushing to hunt while exhausted and poorly positioned would lead to mistakes. Mistakes here meant death just as surely as mistakes on the ice had. They found a protected cove a mile from the walrus beach. A cliff face blocked the north wind, and a freshwater stream, frozen now but identifiable, meant water when they could melt ice. This would be home for the next several months. The work began immediately. A shelter larger than their traveling tent was needed. They used stones to build walls, piling them carefully, filling gaps with snow that would freeze and seal. The roof was their walrus hide tent, supported by driftwood they found along the shore. It took 3 days to build, but when finished, the shelter was solid. Not comfortable by any measure, but capable of housing 13 men through the worst storms winter could bring. Food had to be secured. They had some supplies remaining, but not enough for months. Hunting was essential. Seal, walrus, whatever they could take. Fish could be caught through the ice if they found the right locations. Thomas proved skilled at finding seal breathing holes. These small openings in the ice were seals' surface to breathe. A patient hunter could wait by a hole and spear a seal when it appeared. It required hours of motionless standing in brutal cold, but it worked. Michael was the best fisherman. He found places where the ice was thin enough to cut through, dropped lines with hooks baited with bits of seal meat, and pulled up fish that looked strange to English eyes but tasted good enough. Edmund led the walrus hunting, his experience crucial. Walrus were hunted carefully, selecting animals that had separated from the main herd. A group effort, multiple spears, quick work to finish the kill and retreat before other walruses attacked. The first successful walrus hunt brought both meat and ivory. The creature was massive, perhaps 12 feet long and weighing more than a ton. Moving it was exhausting work, but the reward was significant. Meat for many meals, blubber for fuel, hide for repairs, and tusks that made the entire journey worthwhile. Robert participated in the butchering, learning from Edmund's demonstrations. Nothing was wasted. Organs were saved for immediate eating, rich in nutrients they needed. Meat was cut into strips and frozen, natural refrigeration that preserved it perfectly. The tusks were extracted carefully, massive curved pieces of ivory that gleamed even in the pale winter light.
These would be carried home, traded for silver, distributed among the men according to shares agreed upon before the journey began. Life settled into new patterns. No longer the endless walking of the ice crossing, but still hard work. Hunting, preparing food, maintaining the shelter, gathering what little fuel existed. Driftwood was collected obsessively, every piece hoarded for the fires they would need. At night, in their stone and hide shelter, the men talked more than they had during the crossing. Energy was less constrained now that they were stationary. Stories were shared, though carefully. Too much talking before sleep made rest difficult in the cold. Robert learned about Edmund's youth, about Thomas's family, about the lives each man had left behind. These quiet conversations built bonds. They were no longer just a group of men on a journey. They were becoming something closer to family. Simon recovered slowly from his amputation. The wound healed cleanly, which was fortunate. Infection in this place would have been a death sentence. He limped, would always limp, but he could work. He helped with camp tasks, with food preparation, with the 100 small chores that kept them alive. Weeks passed. The sun rose later and set earlier each day. They were moving deeper into winter, into the months of darkness that defined this latitude. Soon there would be barely any daylight at all, just endless night punctuated by brief twilight. William began to worry about fuel. They had collected much driftwood, but would it be enough? Seal blubber burned, giving both heat and light, but using it meant not eating it. Every decision involved trade-offs. One night, a storm arrived with violence that shocked even those who thought they understood Arctic weather. Wind screamed around their shelter with force that seemed to want to tear the very stones apart. Snow drove horizontally, finding every gap, every weakness. The men huddled inside, bodies pressed together for warmth. The shelter held, but barely. At the height of the storm, they could hear nothing but wind. It was as if the world consisted of only wind and cold, and the desperate hope that their walls would not fail. The storm lasted 2 days. When it finally passed, drifts had piled against their shelter so high that the door was buried. They had to dig themselves out, tunneling through snow that had packed hard as ice. Outside, the landscape had changed. Familiar landmarks were buried. The shore was obscured. Even the walrus beach was hidden under fresh snow, though they could hear the animals calling to each other, undisturbed by weather that would have killed humans in hours. They dug out their shelter, reinforced weak points the storm had revealed, and took stock. Everyone had survived. Supplies were intact. The ivory they had collected was safe. They had weathered the storm. But it was a reminder. Winter here was not finished with them. More storms would come. Darker days lay ahead.
They had survived the ice crossing and the first storm, but the hardest part of their journey might still be ahead. As the darkest months arrived, with barely any daylight and temperatures that fell to levels that seemed impossible to endure, the men drew closer together. Physical warmth was essential, but psychological warmth mattered too. Isolation and darkness could break minds as surely as cold broke bodies. They established routines to combat the darkness. Wake at the same time each day, even when there was no light to wake to. Eat at regular intervals. Work at camp improvements. Tell stories. Anything to mark time, to maintain the rhythms that kept humans sane. Robert struggled more than most. At 17, the darkness pressed on him heavily. He was homesick, frightened, often close to despair. But the others supported him, Edmund especially. The old man had seen young men face this before, knew how to help them through. The sun will return, Edmund promised. It always does. Winter does not last forever, though when you're in the middle of it, it feels endless. These words, simple and true, helped. Robert held on to them during the darkest hours. The group hunted by firelight on the rare occasions they could spare the fuel. Walrus were visible even in darkness, their pale forms against dark stone. The ivory collection grew. When spring came and they could return across the ice, they would carry fortune home with them. But spring felt impossibly distant. The cold deepened to levels they had not experienced during the crossing. Metal became brittle, leather froze solid. Even breathing felt dangerous, as if the air itself might freeze their lungs. One morning, John woke and could not feel his hands. Frostbite had struck during the night despite all precautions. William and Edmund worked quickly, warming the hands carefully, trying to restore circulation without damaging tissue further.
Some feeling returned, but John lost parts of 3 fingers. They turned black and fell off over the following weeks. He bore it stoically, knowing it could have been worse. He could still work with partial hands. Others had lost more. This was the price of Arctic winter. The cold took pieces of you, literally and figuratively. You paid it and moved on, or you didn't move on at all. Time became strange in the constant darkness. Days blurred together. Only their strict routine kept them oriented. Wake, eat, work, sleep. Over and over. The cycle was all that marked one day from the next. Stories became more important. Each man shared tales from his life, adventures he had had, people he had known. These stories were gifts, pieces of humanity shared to combat the inhumanity of the environment. Robert told about his village, about his mother's cooking, about the festival days when everyone danced and laughed. The memories hurt, but they also sustained him. They reminded him why he was here, what he would return to.
William spoke of his years at sea, of storms and calms, of lands he had seen. His stories made the world seem larger, reminded them that beyond this frozen darkness, life continued in warmth and light. Thomas rarely spoke, but when he did, his words carried weight. He talked about his first wife, lost to fever, and how he had learned to carry grief without letting it destroy him. The lesson resonated in this place, where grief was always close. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, the darkness began to lift. Not much. A few minutes more of twilight each day, but those minutes mattered enormously. They meant the turn had come. Winter was loosening its absolute grip. The returning light brought renewed energy. Men moved with more purpose. Hunting increased. They wanted to maximize their ivory collection before the ice became too unstable for the return journey. A second large storm tested them, but they were better prepared now. The shelter held more easily. Their confidence had grown. They knew they could survive. By the time something resembling spring appeared, with the sun actually rising above the horizon for brief periods, they had collected ivory worth more than any of them had dared hope. 40 walrus tusks, carefully wrapped and stored, ready for transport. The journey home would be as dangerous as the journey out. Ice that had been stable during deep winter would become unpredictable as temperatures rose. Leads would open without warning. The crossing would need to be timed carefully. William watched the ice and the weather patterns obsessively. Too early, and they'd face severe cold. Too late, and the ice would break up, stranding them for another year. The window was narrow. He made the decision one morning when the sun showed strongly and the ice looked stable. We leave in 3 days. Prepare everything. Those 3 days were frantic. The shelter was dismantled, useful materials packed. Food for the journey was selected and portioned. Ivory was distributed among the sleds for balanced loads. Every detail mattered. Simon's foot had healed well enough for walking, though his limp was pronounced. He would manage the journey. John adapted to his partial hands, learning to grip and pull despite missing fingers. Humans were remarkably adaptable when survival depended on it. On the morning of departure, they stood at the edge of the shore ice, looking out at the frozen sea they would need to cross again. It looked different now, less solid somehow. Spring was working its subtle magic, weakening what had seemed permanent. "Stay close," William ordered. "Watch for my signals. Stop when I stop. This crossing will be different from the first." They stepped onto the ice. The journey home had begun. The return journey revealed its differences immediately. The ice sang differently now, higher pitched, more frequent. Cracks appeared that had not been there during the outbound crossing. The frozen sea was preparing to become liquid ocean again, and they needed to cross before that transformation completed. William set a faster pace than he had coming out. Speed created risk, but so did delay. They needed to cover ground quickly while the ice still held. Every day mattered, every hour potentially. The first 2 days went well. They covered perhaps 7 miles each day, good distance with heavy loads of ivory. The sleds pulled harder now than they had coming out, weighted with treasure. But determination pulled them forward. On the 3rd day, they encountered their first serious crack. A lead perhaps 10 feet wide, newly opened, ice edges sharp and fresh. The water below looked dark and hungry. They built a bridge using pieces of broken ice, carefully positioning slabs to create a path across. Delicate work, dangerous work. One sled at a time crossed, men holding ropes ready to pull if anything went wrong. Nothing went wrong. All men and all sleds made it across. But it took hours, and they could feel the ice shifting beneath them. The window was closing. They needed to move faster. That night, William reduced sleep time, 4 hours instead of 6.
More time moving, less time resting. It was exhausting, but necessary. The men understood and accepted it without complaint. Days blurred together in renewed rhythm. Walk, cross obstacles, walk more. Rest briefly, walk again. The ivory sleds were heavy, shoulders ached, but no one suggested leaving any behind. This was why they had come. This was the prize that made everything worthwhile. Robert found strength he hadn't known he possessed. When exhaustion threatened to overwhelm him, he thought of his mother's face when he returned wealthy. He thought of his sister's future secured. The images pushed him forward. On the 7th day they encountered a lead too wide to cross, perhaps 100 yards of open water, steaming in the cold air. They would need to go around. William chose south, following the lead's edge. They walked for an entire day before finding where it narrowed enough to bridge. More precious time lost, but there was no alternative. The crossing here was terrifying. Ice floes again, but smaller and less stable than before. William went first, testing the route. The floes tilted and shifted under his weight. This was barely possible. But barely possible was enough. One by one the men crossed. Robert slipped on his third jump, his boot breaking through the thin ice edge of a floe. Frigid water soaked his foot before he could pull himself up. Edmund, crossing behind him, helped pull him back. They got everyone across, but Robert's wet boot became a serious problem. In the cold, water froze almost immediately. His foot was encased in ice inside the leather. They couldn't stop to address it properly. They needed to keep moving while light remained. Robert walked on frozen foot, each step painful. Frostbite was inevitable now.
How bad would depend on how quickly they could camp and thaw his foot properly. They made camp at the first reasonable spot. The fire was built quickly, and Robert's boot was cut off. His foot was white, ice crystals visible on the skin. William and Edmund worked to warm it slowly, carefully. Too fast would cause more damage. Feeling returned painfully. Robert bit down on a leather strap to keep from screaming. The pain was extraordinary, worse than anything he had experienced. But pain meant the Kishu was still alive. Numbness would have been worse. He lost 2 toes. They turned black over the next days, just as Simon's had. But the rest of his foot survived. He would walk with a limp, like Simon, but he would walk. The ice claimed its price. It always did. They continued. 11 days into the return journey, food was running lower than planned. The detours had cost them supplies as well as time. William cut rations. Smaller portions, more hunger, but no choice. Hunger made the cold feel worse. Bodies burned calories to stay warm, and fewer calories meant less warmth. The mathematics were cruel but simple. On day 14 they saw a landmark, a pressure ridge that William remembered from the outbound journey. They were perhaps halfway across. The recognition brought both relief and concern. Halfway meant far to go with limited supplies. That night they discussed options. Could they hunt on the ice? Seals sometimes hauled out on the ice, but finding them would mean deviating from the route, gambling time against potential food. William decided against it. Keep moving. Hunger was manageable. Starvation was still days away. Better to push through than risk getting lost searching for seals. The decision was hard but probably correct. They walked on, stomachs growling, bodies weakening slightly each day, but still moving forward. Day 17 brought another storm. Not as violent as the winter storms had been, but bad enough. They waited it out in their tent, huddled together, conserving energy while wind and snow raged outside. The storm passed after 1 day, but it had erased their trail and disoriented them slightly. William used the sun to reorient, but they lost half a day finding their direction again. Supplies were now critically low. 3 days of food remained, maybe 4 if they stretched it desperately. Land had to be close. Had to be. On day 20 they saw it, the Norwegian coast, dark mountains rising from the ice, unmistakable and beautiful. Relief flooded through the group. They had made it. Almost. The final approach to shore was tricky. The ice near land was broken and unstable, as it had been at the other end. They navigated carefully, testing each step, refusing to make mistakes now when safety was so close. By evening of day 20, they stepped off the ice onto Norwegian soil. 13 men had crossed out. 13 men crossed back. Simon missing a toe, John missing parts of 3 fingers, Robert missing 2 toes.
But alive. All alive. They made camp on the shore, the first night on solid ground in 20 days. The relief was profound. No more ice shifting beneath them. No more leads opening unexpectedly. Solid earth that did not move. The ivory was intact, all 40 tusks safely brought across. The fortune they had sought was in hand. The journey had succeeded. Over the following days, they made their way down the coast to the nearest settlement. News of their return spread quickly. 13 men had gone into the Arctic winter and returned with ivory.
It was a story worth telling. The ivory was sold, fairly distributed according to the shares agreed upon months before. Robert's share was enough to change his family's life. His mother wept when he returned, both at seeing him alive and at seeing the silver he brought. Simon bought a small farm and retired from dangerous ventures. His missing toe served as reminder enough of what exploration could cost. John continued sailing, but stayed to warmer waters. His partial hands worked well enough for most tasks, and he had no desire to risk more fingers. Edmund used his share to ensure his remaining years would be comfortable. He had made his last great journey and survived. That was triumph enough. William returned to the ice 2 years later, leading another expedition. The ice was in his blood now. He crossed 3 more times before age finally stopped him. Thomas remained William's loyal second on those journeys, quiet, competent, essential. He survived them all and died peacefully in his bed at age 60. Robert made one more journey north, 5 years later. He was older, wiser, more cautious. He returned safely with more ivory, further securing his family's prosperity. But that second journey was his last. He had proven what he needed to prove. The ice crossing became a story told in coastal villages. 13 men who walked across frozen ocean to find walrus ivory, who survived storms and cold and all the dangers that made such journeys usually fatal. The story grew in the telling, as stories do, but the core remained true. Ordinary men had done something extraordinary. They had faced the ice and survived. Years later, Robert would tell his own children about the journey. He would describe the sound of ice singing in the morning, the way cold bit through every layer of clothing, the fear of crossing leads on ice floes that shifted and tilted. He would show them his missing toes and explain that the ice always claims its price. But he would also explain that some things were worth paying for. His children grew up in comfort because he had been willing to walk across frozen ocean. The lessons of the ice stayed with all of them: patience, preparation, cooperation, respect for forces larger than yourself. These were not just survival skills. They were life skills. William, in his later years, was often asked how they had survived when so many other expeditions failed.
His answer was always simple. We worked together, we planned carefully, we respected the ice, and we were lucky. Luck mattered, he knew that. All the skill and preparation in the world could not guarantee survival when you ventured into places that cold, that remote, that indifferent to human life. But skill and preparation improved your odds, and odds were what made the difference between stories told by survivors and stories told about the dead. The ice remained. Other men crossed it in later years, some successfully, some not. The ice did not care. It sang its morning song to all of them equally, a sound both beautiful and terrible, a reminder that some places on Earth would never fully belong to humans, no matter how far they traveled. On quiet mornings, decades later, Robert would sometimes wake early and listen. He could still hear it in his memory, the ice song. High notes and low notes, cracks and groans, the frozen sea speaking its ancient language. He would feel the cold phantom ache in his missing toes and remember the walk across endless white, remember the weight of ivory sleds, remember 13 men bound together by shared danger and shared determination. He would remember, and he would be grateful. Grateful for the journey, grateful for its success, grateful even for the price paid. The ice had taught him what he was capable of enduring. That knowledge had shaped everything that came after. As old age approached, Robert's children would ask if he regretted the journey, if losing toes to frostbite made him wish he had stayed home. He would smile and shake his head. Regret? No. Those toes bought us everything we have. They were a fair trade. And perhaps they were. Perhaps all the prices paid by those 13 men, toes and fingers and months of fear and cold, were fair trades for what they gained. Not just ivory and silver, but knowledge of themselves, of what humans could endure and accomplish when they had no choice but to succeed. The medieval world moved on. New trade routes opened. The demand for walrus ivory eventually declined as elephants were hunted in Africa. The dangerous Arctic crossings became less necessary, less profitable. But the stories remained. Stories of men who walked across ice seas, who survived in darkness and cold that modern people could barely imagine, who brought back treasures from the edge of the known world. William's last words, as an old man dying peacefully in bed, were reported to be, "The ice sings every morning. Listen."
Whether he was speaking to those present or remembering his journeys, no one knew, but those who had crossed with him understood. The ice song was something that stayed with you. Once heard, truly heard, in that place where it was born, it never fully left. And so the story ends where it began, with the ice singing in the morning, with men moving in silence across frozen vastness, with survival earned through skill, luck, and the refusal to surrender.
The ice is still there, still singing, still testing anyone brave or foolish enough to cross it. The cold remains, patient and eternal, waiting for the next expedition, the next group of men who think they can survive what has killed so many before them. Some will succeed, some will fail. The ice does not judge. It simply exists, beautiful and deadly, a reminder that the world contains places that humans can visit but never truly conquer. If you found peace in this story of quiet survival and ancient journeys across ice, please consider subscribing to this channel for more tales that help you relax and drift into restful contemplation. Thank you for traveling with us across the frozen sea. Sleep well, and may your journey be gentle.